At exactly 1 o'clock in the morning on November 15th, 1942, the sea between Guadalcanal and Savo Island looked almost quiet. No mon. Heavy clouds smothered the starlight. From the surface, Iron Bottom Sound was just a wide, black sheet of water broken only by the orange glow of distant fires where ships were already out of action. To the Japanese lookouts scanning that darkness, the battle seemed nearly finished. American destroyers were disabled. One American battleship was clearly under heavy fire. The way to bombard Henderson Field looked open. But on the bridge of USS Washington, it did not look finished at all. Inside Washington, there was no darkness. Radar screens washed the plotting rooms and control stations in soft green and amber light. In front of a circular display, an operator watched a bright Echo sitting at a range of roughly 8,400 yards, bearing a little left of the bow. That Echo was large, steady, and alone. The operators knew exactly what that meant. Primary target, large surface contact. Likely battleship, came the calm voice over the internal circuit. That was the Japanese battleship Kirishima, moving slowly, unaware that she had become a perfect target on an American radar screen. On the bridge, Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee stood beside Captain Glenn Davis. Outside, nothing was visible except faint reflections of flames far astern where American destroyers had been hit, and the dim silhouette of South Dakota withdrawing after a brutal few minutes under concentrated Japanese fire. But in Lee's headset he could hear the radar plot describing distance, bearing, course, and speed of every major ship in the Japanese formation. He knew where they were. They did not know where he was. For nearly 20 minutes, Washington had been following the Japanese movements entirely through electronics. The Japanese searchlights and gun flashes had given away some positions, but the real picture came from spinning antennas and the quiet voices of specialists reporting numbers. From that information, systems deep inside Washington were already solving a set of problems. How fast both ships were moving, how long shells would fly, where to point the guns so that steel leaving the barrels now would meet a ship that would not reach that point for another 20 seconds. The Japanese officers on Kirishima had none of that. They had binoculars, rangefinders, and an ocean of blackness in front of them. They could see the glow of burning destroyers behind South Dakota. They could see their own searchlights probing the dark. They could not see the American battleship that was now lining up its entire main battery on them. Washington was silent, engines turning smoothly, guns already trained by instruments. Kirishima was moving forward, thinking the biggest threat in the area was the battered shape of South Dakota. In those few seconds before the first salvo, the entire culture of night fighting in the Pacific was about to flip. For 2 years, darkness had favored the Imperial Japanese Navy. Their officers trusted their eyes, their optics, their torpedoes. Now, for the first time, darkness would favor a ship that did not need to see its opponent at all. Admiral Lee glanced once more at the radar plot. The Echo representing Kirishima was solid, almost steady on the screen. The range was closing slowly, but everything was within the window he had rehearsed again and again in training. He turned to Davis. "Stand by, Glenn. This is the one." Captain Davis relayed the order that would make history. The turret captains waited, listening for the phrase they had practiced countless times but never used like this, with no visual target.
Main batterie, commence firing.
9 16-inch guns spoke at once. The muzzle blast lit Washington like a brief sunrise, then darkness closed again. In that instant, the Japanese finally knew that somewhere out there, hidden beyond their vision, was another battleship. They had no idea that it could already see them more clearly than any pair of eyes ever would. To understand why those 7 minutes mattered so much, you have to see what the night had looked like before Washington arrived. For most of 1942, nighttime on the sea belonged to the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was not an accident, it was a doctrine. 4 decades between the wars, Japanese officers had trained with one idea firmly in mind. When the sun went down, they would turn the darkness itself into a weapon. Destroyer crews drilled on night approaches until they could work almost by instinct. They memorized silhouettes, practiced identifying ships by shape and mast arrangement against the faintest horizon glow. Optical equipment was superb. Long-base rangefinders and high-quality binoculars coupled with crews chosen for sharp eyesight. Most importantly, their torpedoes were extraordinary. The Type 93, known later to Americans as the Long Lance, could travel at high speed over distances that seemed impossible to those used to shorter-range weapons. It used oxygen-enriched propulsion that left almost no visible trail. In training, Japanese officers learned to imagine sweeping arcs across the sea where their torpedoes would travel unseen, reaching ships that were convinced they were beyond danger. The United States, on paper, had something just as revolutionary: radar. Early sets could detect aircraft and surface ships far beyond visual range, even at night or through clouds. But having a new tool is not the same as knowing how to fight with it. At Savo Island in August, American cruisers and destroyers guarding the approaches to Guadalcanal had radar sets. Some detected contacts at astonishing ranges. On one ship, an operator saw a cluster of echoes appear on his scope more than 20 miles away. But the warning moved slowly up the chain of command. By the time the captain on the bridge was fully convinced something was there, Japanese cruisers were already closing at high speed. When Japanese searchlights snapped on and torpedoes began to run, the advantage was gone. 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sent to the bottom in little more than half an hour. The radar had not failed technically. The fleet had failed to believe in it. Later that year at Cape Esperance, the picture improved but remained confused. This time, American ships did use radar to gain the element of surprise. An American column crossed in front of a Japanese formation, a classic tactical maneuver. But in the congestion of the night, with ships turning, ranges changing, and incomplete understanding of how to handle radar contacts, some American guns fired at friendly ships. A destroyer charging forward thought she was engaging the enemy and instead passed briefly into the line of fire of her own cruisers. The lesson was uncomfortable. Radar could give an early warning, but it could just as easily feed chaos if everyone involved did not have a clear system for interpreting and acting on the information. Many senior officers came away from those battles cautious. They trusted their own eyes and long experience more than a glowing line on an electronic screen. Then came the early November fights around Guadalcanal. In one brutal engagement, American cruisers and Japanese battleships fought at ranges so short that gunners aligned on muzzle flashes. Searchlights carved tunnels of brightness through powder smoke. Ships were hit at distances where even the most primitive rangefinders could work. It was courageous and desperate, but not modern. 2 American admirals lost their lives in that action. Henderson Field survived one more night, but the price in ships and crews was enormous. In all of these clashes, radar was present as an accessory, a useful extra pair of ears in the darkness, but not the main sense. Tactical decisions were still built around what could be seen from the bridge and from the directors. Nobody had yet committed to the idea that a ship could, or should, fight a full engagement essentially blind to the eye and fully guided by electronics. There was, however, one flag officer who had been quietly watching every action report, every technical note, every mention of radar successes and failures. He was not satisfied to treat it as just another instrument. He believed it could be the central nervous system of a ship. That officer was Willis Augustus Lee, and he intended to prove that if you built your entire method of fighting around radar, the night itself would change sides. Willis Lee did not look like the stereotype of a revolutionary. He was not a young officer trying to overturn tradition. He was in his mid-50s by the time he sailed into Iron Bottom Sound. His hair had gone grey at the temples. He spoke quietly. He preferred calculations to speeches. But behind that calm exterior was a mind completely at home with precision. Years before the war, Lee had stood on a very different firing line, the Olympic shooting range at Antwerp in 1920. There, with a rifle in his hands instead of a battleship under his feet, he collected 7 medals, 5 of them gold. In long-range shooting, tiny changes, gusts of wind, variation in powder temperature, slight shifts in posture, separate a hit from a near miss. Lee learned, and never forgot, that reliable results come from understanding every variable you can measure. The Navy, of course, knew this too. Battleship gunnery had always been a matter of range tables, corrections, and careful spotting. Between the wars, Lee rose through roles that dealt directly with those problems. He worked in fleet training. He oversaw exercises in which entire task forces fired at moving targets, adjusting for roll, pitch, wind, and target motion. He became intimately familiar with the mechanical fire control computers that turned wheels and gears into firing solutions. So when the first reports about radar arrived, radio waves bouncing off distant objects and returning as timed echoes, Lee immediately saw something other officers did not. To many, radar was a clever way to find ships in fog or planes in the dark. To Lee, it was a way to measure range and bearing with a consistency that human eyes could never match. He studied everything he could get his hands on: British reports on ground-based radar used during the Battle of Britain, technical notes from American laboratories, early performance charts for shipborne sets that tracked aircraft and surface contacts. When other officers visited radar labs as a formality, Lee came with questions. How stable was the range measurement? How quickly could the antenna rotate? What was the angular resolution? How did sea state or rain affect returns? These were not abstract curiosities. In his mind, each answer translated into something very specific. At what range could he trust these numbers enough to aim 16-inch guns and expect the shells to fall close without seeing their splash? When Lee was given command of Battleship Division 6, including the new North Carolina-class battleship USS Washington, he saw his chance. Washington was fast, heavily armed, and crucially, equipped with the latest American radar systems. The ship carried an air search set for early warning, a surface search set specifically suited to detecting ships on the horizon, and fire control radars mounted on the directors that controlled the main battery. Many captains interpreted these as improved support devices for long-established methods. Lee did not. He decided that Washington would train as if her primary eyes were electronic. Night after night off the East Coast, he ordered exercises in which the ship fired at targets it never saw, relying entirely on radar to provide range input to the mechanical computers. It was not a smooth process at first. Radar sets required constant maintenance. Vacuum tubes ran hot and sometimes failed. Antennas needed careful alignment. The plotting teams had to learn how to translate moving echoes into target courses and speeds. But Lee persisted, and he made sure that the people who operated these systems understood not just which knobs to turn, but why the numbers mattered. Slowly, a different culture took root aboard Washington. Rangefinders and lookouts were still respected and used in daylight, but at night the crew grew more comfortable glancing at glowing screens than at the horizon. The plotting room staff knew that when they called out a distance and bearing, the admiral would act on it. By the time Washington left the Atlantic and sailed for the Pacific, she was something unusual, a battleship whose commander genuinely believed that, under the right conditions, his ship could fight better at night than in daylight, because darkness would strip away the enemy's advantages in optics and leave his own electronics unmatched. The test of that belief would not come on a peaceful training range. It would come at a time when the entire American position in the South Pacific was being held together by a single, rough airstrip on a jungle island. Guadalcanal was not supposed to be the stage for a technology revolution. It began as a desperate bid to stop Japanese expansion toward vital sea routes. The Americans landed Marines, scraped an airfield out of the jungle, and named it Henderson Field. From that rough strip, aircraft could threaten Japanese shipping lines and prevent the island from becoming a base for further advances. But as summer turned to autumn in 1942, Guadalcanal became something else, a grinding, continuous contest of logistics and nerve. By November, the Marines were tired, supplies were thin, and almost every piece of equipment on the island depended on that airfield staying in operation. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood this perfectly. If Henderson Field could be neutralized, even temporarily, Japanese transports could rush troops and material to the island. Once their forces on the ground could match or exceed the Americans, the tenuous foothold would be at risk. The most direct way to silence Henderson Field at night was with naval gunfire. A single modern battleship, with heavy shells and rapid fire, could crater runways, damage fuel and ammunition storage, and make the airfield unusable, at least long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The first major attempt to do this, on the night of November 13th, had been intercepted by an American cruiser-destroyer force. The resulting close-range fight stopped the bombardment mission, but the American ships paid a high price. Several cruisers were out of action. 2 admirals did not return. Many remaining ships were damaged and needed repairs. The second attempt, involving another Japanese battleship, had also been disrupted, this time by air power and smaller surface forces. That ship never completed its mission either. Now a third attempt was forming under Vice Admiral Nobute Kondo. The core was Battleship Kirishima, supported by heavy and light cruisers and a strong escort of destroyers trained in night combat. Their objective was simple and precise: reach the waters off Guadalcanal, turn their guns toward Henderson Field, and bombard it thoroughly enough that aircraft could not operate from it in the critical next days. Back at American headquarters, Admiral William Bull Halsey was running out of options. The cruiser force had been bled white. Carrier planes, while powerful by day, could not fight in the dark. Yet if he did nothing, Henderson Field, or what remained of it after earlier actions, would almost certainly be struck, and the fragile balance on the island would tilt sharply. The only significant heavy units still available were the fast battleships Washington and South Dakota, operating with a small screen of destroyers. They were meant to guard the last operational carrier in the area, but Halsey saw that if the airfield fell, the campaign might crumble regardless of what the carrier could do. He made a choice that would make every officer involved very aware of the stakes. He ordered those battleships, and their 4 accompanying destroyers, to head into Iron Bottom Sound and confront the Japanese force at night. That task group was labeled Task Force 64. On paper, it looked dangerously small. 2 big ships and 4 smaller ones against a combined enemy force that included 1 battleship, multiple cruisers, and nearly a dozen destroyers. All of those Japanese ships had crews accustomed to night fighting. Their torpedoes were widely feared. Their officers had every reason to believe that night still belonged to them. The only advantage Task Force 64 carried was invisible, the radar equipment on its battleships, and the experience of one admiral who had decided that if they were going to fight, they would do so completely differently than any American formation had done before. As the sun set on November 14th and the last light faded behind the jungle silhouettes of Guadalcanal, Washington led her small group toward the narrow waters that had already claimed so many hulls. The sea there had earned its grim nickname because of the number of ships resting on its floor. The crews of Task Force 64 knew the stories. They understood what it meant to steam into that channel in the dark. On Washington's bridge, though, the focus was not on ghosts beneath the waves. It was on smooth-running generators, steady antenna rotations, and the readiness reports from radar rooms and plotting spaces. The next few hours would determine not only whether Henderson Field would still be launching aircraft in the morning, but also whether Lee's years of thinking about radar as a true weapon had been right. The entry into Iron Bottom Sound on that humid night felt like sailing into a tunnel. High land on Guadalcanal to starboard and Savo Island to port narrowed the world for the crews on deck. But for the team in Washington's radar plot, the geography simplified the problem. Any sizable contact moving through that funnel toward the island would almost certainly be part of Condo's force. Lee arranged his formation in a simple but brutal pattern. Out front were the 4 destroyers, Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn. Behind them came Washington, then South Dakota. The idea was clear. The destroyers would be the first to make contact, the first to draw fire, and the first to face torpedoes. They had speed and agility, but in terms of protection they were fragile compared to the battleships. Lee knew exactly what he was asking of those crews. In many ways, he was recreating on the surface what had already happened in the air. Smaller, more expendable units shielding larger ones. The destroyer's job was to disrupt enemy torpedo attacks, engage opposing destroyers, and generally create confusion in front of the battleships. The price would almost certainly be heavy. Before midnight, radar operators on Washington began to see the first faint returns from beyond Savo Island. Spots appeared on the screen, moved, strengthened. The picture sharpened as the range closed. Soon there were clearly 3 groups, one that looked like a screen of lighter ships, one cluster that likely represented cruisers, and a larger, slower contact that could only be a capital ship. Lee watched the plot develop. He knew that when strikes came, they would come from the Japanese destroyers first. Their commanders had built their night doctrine around rapid torpedo spreads at longer ranges than Americans were used to, followed by gunfire illuminated by searchlights. The opening blows would almost certainly fall on his own screening destroyers. On the lead ship, Walk, Commander Thomas Fraser had his own radar, a more modest set than Washington's, but still a powerful tool. As the range fell, he too saw echoes resolving into enemy ships. Fraser requested permission to launch torpedoes first, using his radar bearings to send his own spread into the Japanese formation. There was logic in the idea. Torpedoes in the water might force the Japanese to turn, disrupting their carefully rehearsed formations and possibly opening gaps. Lee had to make a difficult choice. He refused. His reasoning was as technical as it was tactical. The waters ahead were about to be filled with Japanese torpedoes. American torpedoes, once launched, would also be running through that same space. In the confusion of a night battle, with ships cranking their rudders to avoid real and imagined tracks, he feared that his own torpedoes would become a second, invisible threat to his battleships. The destroyers would have to rely on their guns at first. Within minutes, the theory became reality. On the Japanese side, a lead destroyer picked up the American screen visually. With no radar to guide them, they fell back on their drills, open with torpedoes, then illuminate and fire. Long-range torpedoes slid into the water. Japanese crews turned on powerful searchlights that cut through the darkness and found the form of an American destroyer. In an instant, the target silhouette was outlined for every Japanese gun in range. Shells began to fall. From Washington's bridge, men could see sudden blooms of orange on the horizon, hear the distant rumble of exploding shells, and see the eerie white beams of searchlights sweeping and holding. Reports from the destroyers came back in short, clipped phrases: engaging, taking fire, maneuvering. In the radar plot, though, the picture remained abstract: tracks crossing, some slowing, some veering. The echoes representing the American destroyers stuttered and faded. One disappeared completely. Another lost speed abruptly. The shield was being broken. But it had done precisely what Lee anticipated. Every Japanese eye, every rangefinder, every searchlight was now focused on the forward part of the American formation. The battleships, hanging back in darkness, remained untouched, their radar sets hearing everything. As Walk's echo vanished from the screen and others flickered, the cost of that shield became very real. Yet the time it bought would prove irreplaceable. In those minutes, Washington continued to refine the tracks of the larger Japanese ships. Data flowed from the surface search radar to the fire control teams. The range to the enemy battleship, still unseen to anyone looking out of a porthole, was shrinking into a zone Lee had practiced again and again. The destroyers out front were, in effect, paying in steel and lives for a clear radar picture behind them. When the lead echoes finally disappeared entirely and the others fell away, there was no triumph aboard Washington, only a quiet recognition that the next phase now belonged to the heavy ships. And just as that shift was happening, another American battleship was about to step into a spotlight she did not want. USS South Dakota had sailed into Iron Bottom Sound beside Washington, but her captain, Thomas Gatch, saw the battle differently than Lee. Where Lee wanted his battleships to remain in the shadows, using radar to watch and wait, Gatch favored a more direct approach. As the engagement developed, South Dakota edged ahead of her consort, taking a position closer to the dissolving screen of destroyers. At first, her radar sets were working. She picked up large surface contacts at substantial distances. Fire control teams began preparing firing solutions. The big guns were loaded, ready to respond when orders came. Then, at precisely the wrong moment, a technical problem became a tactical crisis. Earlier in the day, engineers had been adjusting parts of the ship's electrical system. A circuit breaker had tripped, and in an attempt to restore power quickly, it was reset under load, a practice regulations forbade for exactly the reason that now unfolded. The breaker tripped again, and this time its failure cascaded through link circuits. Lights went out. Radar screens blanked. Interior communications faltered. Ventilation fans slowed to a stop. For a moment, large parts of one of the most modern battleships in the world were simply dark. In that brief blackout, South Dakota did not halt. Momentum carried her forward into the heart of the contested waters. By the time the engineering teams began restoring power, working by battle lanterns and flashlights in sweltering compartments, the ship had moved considerably closer to the center of the Japanese formation than anyone intended. When systems flickered back to life, South Dakota found herself at a distance where Japanese optics worked very well. From the Japanese perspective, the scene shifted dramatically. The searchlights and gunfire that had fixed on American destroyers now caught something much larger. Against the glow of burning wreckage astern, South Dakota's profile stood out clearly. To gunnery officers on Japanese cruisers and on Kirishima, she suddenly appeared as a large, identifiable target in a night that had previously held only small silhouettes. One searchlight locked onto her, then another. Beams intersected on her superstructure. Guns began to speak, from cruisers, destroyers, and Kirishima herself. Shells of multiple calibers traced arcs through the night toward the illuminated shape. The majority could not pierce South Dakota's heavy armor belts or turret faces, but they did not need to. At very close ranges, even medium-caliber hits above the armor could cause extensive practical damage. Shells struck her upper works. Antennas shattered. Fire control directors were damaged. Radar arrays, already struggling from the earlier power failure, were hit repeatedly. Blast and fragments cut cables, bent structures, and set off small fires along the length of the superstructure. For the crew inside, the sensation was of repeated heavy impacts and the sudden loss of systems they relied on. Despite this, South Dakota's vital areas held. Her engines continued to turn. Her major gun turrets could still operate in local control. The internal armor protected magazines and machinery. She was far from lost as a ship, but she had effectively been blinded and partially silenced as a fighting unit. Recognizing that he could no longer contribute usefully to the action, and that staying in the illuminated zone would only invite more punishment, Captain Gatch turned South Dakota away, withdrawing southward out of the immediate engagement area. The Japanese, seeing her turning and receding, might reasonably conclude that they had broken the last major American threat. From their vantage point, the picture looked encouraging. They had cleared destroyers from their path. They had driven off a battleship. Nothing large appeared ahead of them between their formation and the waters off Henderson Field, where their planned bombardment awaited. But their perception was incomplete. All through South Dakota's difficulties, USS Washington had remained behind and slightly offset, invisible to optical instruments, but continuously watching through radar. Her radar operators saw South Dakota's track bend and move away. They saw the concentrated cluster of echoes where Japanese ships were firing. And they saw, quite clearly, the single large contact in that cluster whose course and speed marked it as Kirishima. As Japanese attention followed the retreating South Dakota, no one on their side seemed to realize that one more American battleship remained completely unlit, unspotted, and fully functional. In a night that had started as their domain, they were about to encounter an opponent guided not by what its captain could see from the bridge, but by data streaming in from screens and gears spinning below. Aboard Washington, the battle did not feel chaotic. It felt like a rapidly updating problem in geometry. In the radar plot, the operator watching the SG surface search set reported the main contacts in steady rhythm. Large target, bearing 330, range 8600, now 8400, speed decreasing, course northwest. On a plotting table, those calls became a track drawn in pencil and grease marker, a faint arc showing where the Japanese battleship had been and where it would likely be a minute from now. In another space, the main battery fire control team was using a narrower beam radar mounted on the forward director. Unlike the broad, map-like view of the SG, this set treated Kirishima as its single concern. Its pulses timed the distance directly along the line of fire, feeding precise ranges to the mechanical computer sitting in the plotting room below. That computer, an intricate assembly of rotating shafts, cams, and gears, was designed specifically to turn such information into aiming orders. Into it flowed values: Washington's own speed and course, the bearing and range to the target, estimates of the target's motion, corrections for wind and air conditions. Inside its metal casing, those values combined and recombined, emerging as continuous electrical signals sent to motors in the turrets. In each turret, heavy machinery responded, traversing the guns in azimuth and changing their elevation by small, constant increments. Breaches were already loaded with armor-piercing shells and their bagged powder charges. Safety interlocks were set. Gun captains watched repeaters that told them their barrels matched the ordered position from the director. All they needed was permission. Admiral Lee stood where he could hear both the radar plot and the fire control reports. It was not a dramatic pose. He wore a headset and watched a dimly lit chart rather than the horizon. Years of training and studying had led him to this method. Trust the data, not the temptation to step outside and peer into the darkness. When he was satisfied that the solution was solid, that the target track had been consistent long enough to iron out any initial errors, that the range was well within the envelope he considered ideal, he gave Captain Davis the nod. On the speaking system to the turrets, the order went out. Washington's main battery came to life. The first salvo was as much a test of process as it was an attack. The guns thundered, hurling 9 heavy shells into the night. Inside the plotting room, operators watched for any sign that the target echo might have deviated or that something had gone wrong. They would not be able to see shell splashes directly through radar. This early generation of fire control sets could not reliably distinguish them from the target at such close range. Instead, they relied on the assumption that if the data going in was good, and if the machinery did its job, the shells would fall close. When the first shells reached Kirishima, the effect was immediate and confusing for the Japanese. On the battleship's bridge, Captain Sanji Iwabuchi and his officers had been focused primarily forward, looking for any sign of remaining American ships between them and the island. South Dakota's silhouette had been their main visual reference. The last thing they expected was a salvo from an unseen direction at a range where heavy shells arrived in seconds. Some of those first shells struck Kirishima's superstructure and forward areas. Even without explicit detail, it is enough to say that equipment and positions crucial to coordinated gunnery were disrupted. Optical rangefinders were damaged. Communication lines linking spotting stations, directors, and turrets were cut. Control rooms that normally coordinated the entire ship's fire were thrown into disorder. From Washington's perspective, none of that was visible. All they knew was that their target speed began to change and its motion grew less linear. The track on the radar plot bent slightly. The battleship was slowing, perhaps beginning to turn. The computer accepted new inputs and adjusted. A second salvo went out, followed by a third and a fourth. Each time, the fire control team made only fine corrections. They did not need to see individual shell impacts to know they were achieving effects. The target's gradual loss of speed and increasingly erratic movement told its own story. On Kirishima, local turret teams in aft positions tried to respond. With main directors compromised, they resorted to manual control and guessed ranges based on the brightness of Washington's gun flashes. Those guesses were brave but imprecise. The shells they fired passed near Washington, close enough for some aboard to recall later the sound of heavy projectiles going overhead, but near misses still do no damage. After several salvos, more serious issues developed aboard the Japanese ship. Hits in machinery spaces affected propulsion. Steering equipment was damaged. Flooding began in multiple compartments. To try to prevent ammunition stores from becoming a hazard, crews flooded magazines near areas where fires had started. That necessary action further reduced the battleship's ability to continue effective gunnery. From the moment Washington fired her first salvo until Lee ordered a pause, barely 7 minutes passed. In that span, multiple heavy shells found their mark in vital zones. There was no single moment where one shell finished the opponent. Rather, it was a cumulative result of repeated accurate blows guided by instruments rather than eyesight. When Lee decided to cease fire, it was not out of uncertainty. It was because the radar plot and reports of visible flames from lookouts now that Kirishima was thoroughly burning made it apparent that the Japanese battleship was no longer an organized fighting unit. She had lost speed, lost steering, and lost coherent control of her main battery. The core demonstration was complete. Washington had done something no American battleship had done before, engaged an enemy battleship at night, using radar as the primary sense, and quickly gained a decisive upper hand without taking a hit in return. But the night still held one last danger, and it was already on the move through the water. If gun duels are visible and loud, torpedoes are the opposite, quiet threats moving unseen. When Washington's guns first spoke, Japanese destroyer captains understood immediately that another major ship had entered the fight from a new direction. They might not have known precisely where she was, but they could see the flashes of her 16-inch salvos. To officers trained in night torpedo tactics, those flashes were more than just signs of danger. They were aiming marks. One after another, Japanese destroyers launched spreads of torpedoes toward the area where Washington's guns were lighting the horizon. They could not adjust their aim with radar. They estimated range and bearing from the timing and position of the flashes, using experience gained in many exercises. The torpedoes plunged into the water and accelerated, fanning out through the sea at high speed. From Washington's bridge, no alarm bells rang at first. Torpedoes of that era left minimal traces by design, and at night only the most alert observer could hope to see a faint line on the surface. But Admiral Lee did not intend to wait passively. He had been anticipating exactly this response from the moment he chose to keep his battleship back and unlit. Once the main battery ceased firing, he ordered increased speed and sharp course changes. On the plotting table, he pictured in his mind the likely sectors where torpedoes would be running. The safest place for Washington was not the spot where she had been firing from, and not on any steady, predictable course. The battleship began to zigzag, first swinging hard to one side, then the other, maintaining high speed even in the confined waters. For a vessel of her size, these were demanding maneuvers, but the North Carolina class had been built with speed and agility in mind. Her engines responded. The rudder swung. The hull leaned as she turned. Lookouts began to report what everyone had expected. Faint wakes crossing ahead, then to port, then to starboard. The torpedoes were there, but the ship was no longer where their commanders had intended her to be. A near miss from a torpedo is still a reminder of how close the margin can be. Several tracks crossed within what seemed like very short distances. But in the end, none made contact. Washington threaded her way through the unseen field, helped by a combination of speed, constant maneuvering, and perhaps a measure of good fortune. Behind her, South Dakota was already withdrawing. The damaged destroyers that could still move were also pulling back or assisting survivors from ships that no longer floated. The immediate mission, to stop Kirishima from reaching bombardment range of Henderson Field, was complete. Any further time spent in the narrow, torpedo-filled waters only increased risk without offering much additional benefit. At around 3 a.m, Lee ordered his group to clear Iron Bottom Sound and head southward. Washington, still structurally unscathed, led the way out. The battle for that night was over for her. For Kirishima, the end came later. The damage she had taken from Washington's shells, hits to machinery, steering, and critical internal compartments, had left her with a severe list and limited control. Japanese destroyers came alongside, taking off many crew members in difficult conditions. Efforts to stabilize the battleship proved unsuccessful. Over time, the list increased, and in the early hours she rolled and slipped beneath the surface, coming to rest among the many other wrecks on the floor of Iron Bottom Sound. Numbers can never fully convey the human side of such an event, and this script will not dwell on distressing detail. It is enough to say that many Japanese sailors did not return to shore with their comrades. Many were rescued by accompanying ships. For both sides, the night left long memories. When morning came to Guadalcanal, Henderson Field was still in operation. Its runway surfaces bore the marks of earlier bombardments and constant use, but there were no new craters from heavy shells fired in the dark. Aircraft remained ready to fly. The Marines who depended on that air cover were, for that day at least, protected from a threat that might have changed the entire campaign. From a tactical viewpoint, the engagement could be summarized simply. One American battleship had outfought one Japanese battleship at night. But the deeper significance lay in how it had been done. Washington's radar-directed gunnery had not been a small assist to old methods. It had been the foundation of the whole action. The decision to trust radar completely at close range, to let it guide heavy guns in the absence of any visual spotting, had given Lee an advantage that decades of Japanese night training could not counter. The question now was whether the Navy as a whole would understand what that night had demonstrated, and whether it would rebuild its way of fighting around that lesson. The official reports written after the action read, at first glance, like many others, description of courses, times, shell expenditure, observed hits, torpedo threats. But between lines of technical language, a new pattern began to emerge for those who read carefully. Captain Glenn Davis, commanding Washington, made a point of emphasizing radar's role. He described how the SG surface search set had provided an accurate picture of enemy movements long before they could be seen, and how the fire control radar had delivered reliable ranges that allowed his gunners to open fire with confidence. He noted that the ship's guns had been aimed principally by electronic data in conditions where optical instruments offered little or nothing. For some senior officers, steeped in traditions of visual gunnery, it was a surprising account. Many had been trained to see radar as an adjunct, something that told you roughly where to look with binoculars or where to point a searchlight. The idea that a battleship had essentially fought while blind to the eye, guided by displays and mechanical calculators, was unsettling and intriguing. Admiral Lee himself was clear-eyed in his own assessment. In correspondence with higher command, he wrote that the American advantage that night did not come from superior courage, or more experience, or even from better basic ship design. Japanese crews had demonstrated skill and resolve throughout the campaign. Their torpedoes were excellent. Their officers understood night tactics deeply. The difference, Lee wrote, was radar. It had allowed Washington to engage with precise information while remaining a shadow to the opponent. Inside the Navy, this conclusion acted as a catalyst. In the months that followed, efforts that had already begun in various technical circles accelerated. The concept of a centralized space aboard each large ship, where radar plots, radio reports, and other sensor information could be collected and interpreted for the captain, moved from idea to implementation. These spaces became known as Combat Information Centers, CICS. They were, in essence, organized brains for ships, designed so that no single radar operator or watch officer had to interpret the whole situation alone. Instead, train teams would maintain a live picture of all contacts around the ship or task group, updating courses, speeds, and identifications on plotting boards and repeaters. The procedures used by Washington's radar and plotting teams in November 1942, improvised and refined under Lee's guidance, became raw material for formal doctrine. Manuals began to refer not only to radar operation in a technical sense, how to tune a set, how to repair common faults, but also to how to integrate radar into tactical decision-making. New training courses were established. Sailors and officers learned to read plan position indicator screens, to understand how echoes moved, to anticipate where a contact would be after a few minutes rather than simply where it was at the moment. They practiced coordinating multiple radar sets so that air search and surface search information could be combined, offering both altitude and range, both aircraft and ships. On the tactical side, fleet exercises were redesigned. Instead of night actions built around visually sighted columns exchanging fire at relatively short ranges, war games began to assume that each side could detect the other well beyond the horizon through electronics.
Formations ajusted.
Ships with the best radar were placed where they could act as the primary sensing nodes, feeding information to others. In parallel, the sheer number of radar sets aboard American ships increased dramatically. What had been a limited resource early in the war became a standard fitting. By late 1943 and 1944, even destroyers carried improved surface search radar, and cruisers operated multiple sets for redundancy. The result could be seen in later night battles. At Vela Gulf, American destroyers used radar to track an incoming Japanese group, maneuvered into an ideal position, and launched torpedoes first, achieving surprise the way Japanese ships had done earlier in the war. At Empress Augusta Bay and Cape St. George, American radar-directed gun and torpedo attacks disrupted Japanese attempts to reinforce or withdraw units under cover of darkness. For Japanese commanders, the change felt as if someone had quietly reversed the rules of the game. Maneuvers that had once been reliable, closing at night under cover of darkness, relying on superior optics and long-range torpedoes, now brought them into engagements where unseen opponents already knew their positions, headings, and approximate speeds. They were being detected and targeted before they themselves could gather equivalent information. Japanese radar development did progress, but late and with limited resources. Sets installed on their ships in 1943 and 1944 were roughly equivalent to earlier American models. They lacked the widespread deployment and robust training programs that now underpinned Allied use. And Japan's industrial capacity, already under strain from multiple war fronts and resource shortages, could not keep pace with the rate at which the United States was producing and refining electronic systems. In retrospect, it is easy to see Washington's night action as a clear turning point. At the time, it was one of many hard-fought engagements in a brutal campaign. But its long-term impact lay less in the number of shells fired or ships engaged, and more in the proof it offered that a modern fleet built around electronics could reshape even something as old as naval gunnery. For Admiral Lee personally, the battle confirmed what he had believed quietly for years. Technology, properly understood and trusted, could give a force an advantage that no amount of traditional skill could easily overcome. His later commands would continue to apply that lesson, even as the Pacific War shifted increasingly toward carrier aviation. Yet the story of Washington and Hiroshima also holds a more general lesson, one that goes beyond radar sets and fire control directors. Innovation in war is often pictured as a sudden invention, a new machine, a powerful weapon, a breakthrough device. But what happened off Guadalcanal that November night shows a different pattern. The crucial change was not simply that radar existed, it was that someone chose to restructure how a ship fought around that technology. Admiral Lee was not the engineer who designed the SG radar, nor the scientist who invented fire control systems. His contribution was in understanding them deeply enough to trust them over his own habits. He invested time before the crisis, on quiet training ranges off the American coast, to learn how they behaved, where they were reliable, and where they had limits. When faced with a moment where traditional methods promised only an even or worse fight against a highly skilled opponent, he chose the path he had tested in practice: fight by instruments, not by instinct alone. His crew, in turn, accepted that responsibility. Radar operators who, in other ships, might have been peripheral figures became central. Plotting room staff accustomed to being quiet calculators found themselves at the core of command decisions. Gun crews learned that their orders would come from data they could not see, and that their first salvo might have to be trusted without spotting rounds. That trust was not blind. It was built on careful study and rehearsal. It required humility as well as confidence, a willingness to accept that a set of glowing numbers on a screen could tell more about the battle than any pair of eyes on the bridge. USS Washington continued to serve throughout the war. She escorted fast carriers in major operations, supported amphibious landings with shore bombardment, and was present in some of the largest naval concentrations in history. Her later missions did not always reproduce the dramatic isolation of that 7-minute duel, but the systems and procedures proven that night became part of her everyday work. After the war, as jet aircraft, missiles, and more advanced electronics changed the face of navies again, battleships like Washington gradually left service. Their thick armor and big guns were no longer central to naval doctrine. Washington herself went into reserve and was eventually sold for scrap. Her physical structure disappeared, melted down and reused in other forms. Admiral Lee's career also did not end in fanfare. He continued in high-level commands, guiding battleship groups in support of carrier operations and shore assaults. The constant pressure of long campaigns took a toll on his health. Shortly after the war in the Pacific came to an end, he passed away unexpectedly while still on active duty. His grave in Arlington bears simple markings: his name, rank, and a brief note of his Olympic achievements. The night off Guadalcanal is not carved there. Yet in a different sense, That night did not vanish with the ship or the man. Modern warships, guided missile destroyers, cruisers, and carriers fight almost entirely by sensors and automated systems. Commanding officers make decisions based on screen displays, track identifiers, and data links rather than what they can see through binoculars. Combat information centers hum with activity as teams maintain a constant picture of air and surface contacts, much like the embryonic version inside Washington in 1942. The idea that electronics, not human eyesight, should be at the heart of naval awareness is taken for granted now. But there was a time when that idea was unproven, when senior officers had to decide whether to risk their ships on it. Washington's engagement with Hiroshima is one of the clearest examples of that decision point. It is also a reminder of the quiet contributions that do not always appear on medals or in headlines. The destroyer crews who went ahead knew that they were sailing into the most dangerous part of the fight to shield the larger ships behind them. The engineers and technicians who kept radar sets stable in the heat and turbulence of battle ensured that the data would be there when needed. The plotting teams who turned streams of numbers into coherent tracks formed the nervous system of the ship. And behind it all stood an admiral who combined an athlete's respect for precision with a technician's curiosity and a commander's willingness to accept responsibility. The story of USS Washington's 7-minute duel is, on one level, about a single ship winning a night battle against a powerful opponent and safeguarding an airfield that helped decide a campaign. On another level, it is about how quietly a revolution can happen. There was no grand announcement when Lee ordered commence firing at a target no one could see. There were only voices on headsets, gears turning in a steel box, and a green trace moving across a radar screen. Yet in those minutes, naval warfare stepped fully into the electronic age. Remembering that moment is not just about honoring a specific ship or engagement. It is about understanding that progress in conflict often comes from those willing to look at new tools and say, if this is truly better, then we must be brave enough to change how we fight. On that dark night in Iron Bottom Sound, USS Washington did exactly that, and the course of the Pacific War, and of naval history, shifted with her.